Well, good morning. Thank you for coming to Horticulture House for our seminar today on GDPR. So our first speaker today is Catherine Ripley from Field Seymour Parks. So she'll be able to give you more information on the legal aspects of GDPR, and any questions you may have, feel free to ask as Catherine's running through her presentation. Our second speaker is Edwin Mayer, who will be joining us in about an hour or so, and is going to give you more information on how they have worked that within the actual industry, so how they're implementing GDPR within his organisation. There will be a panel section at the end of the presentations, which again we have a representative from Towergate to have any questions about the legal aspects and insurance purposes as well. So first of all, I'll introduce Catherine. Thank you, Catherine.
Right, okay. So thank you very much, Jan. So I'm Catherine Ripley. I'm a partner at a law firm based in Reading, Field Seymour Parks. I advise on a range of business issues, contracts, intellectual property, trademarks and data protection. And thank you very much for asking me to come along and talk to you today about GDPR. As Anne said, please do jump in and ask questions as I'm going along. I think you'll probably get more out of it that way. I know there is a sort of sweep-up session of questions later on, but please do ask as I'm talking, because and please do not feel that any question is too kind of basic or too stupid. There's probably someone in the room who is interested in the same point, and it's such a wide subject, and there's always fresh questions or fresh perspectives that come up. So please, don't hesitate to ask questions. So just a quick sort of run through what I'm going to be talking about. Why does GDPR matter? Sort of broad outline about what GDPR involves, and sort of next steps and questions for you to think about when you go away from today. So why does GDPR matter? Sorry, just going right back to basics, and apologies if I'm telling you things that you already know. I sort of seem to spend most of my life these days talking about GDPR, but for those who don't already know, GDPR means the General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into force on the 25th of May 2018. The law actually came in May 2016, but there's been a 2-year implementation period to allow businesses to get ready for it. So we're obviously now on the last leg, and for all businesses, large or small, there will be something to do ahead of the 25th of May. And as I say, I'll explain a bit more about what the new rules involve. The other thing to say initially is GDPR is sometimes described as an evolution rather than a revolution. So it's building on existing data protection law, but really bringing it into the 21st century. The 1998 Data Protection Act came into force at a time when the world was quite different, and obviously in the last 20 years the amount of personal data which individuals provide to companies has ballooned dramatically, and data is a really valuable asset, sometimes referred to as the new oil, and the amount of data that is being exchanged has changed or increased dramatically, and so these new rules are intended to bring the law up to date with the world that we now live in. And why does it matter? You may well already be aware of the fact that that there's much higher levels of fines for failure to comply with the new rules, and there's sort of headlines about the fact that the authorities can now impose penalties of up to 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, and obviously that's a kind of headline grabbing sort of statistic, but the important point to take from this is obviously not everybody who doesn't comply with the law isn't going to be stung by that sort of fine, but the intention is to really make privacy a boardroom issue so that it's no longer dealing or failing to deal properly with personal data is can no longer be just regarded as a cost of doing business. There are large global businesses who are making a huge amount of money out of personal data, and they need to be treating it properly. And so the new rules and the new penalties are intended to really hammer that home to them, that this is not an optional thing. They can't decide whether or not they're going to comply with the laws. The authorities are going to have the teeth to punish those who don't comply. And I'm sure you're sort of all aware of the sort of furore in the press over the last week or so regarding Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and that, is kind of has come at a kind of interesting time when we're just on the brink of GDPR, and there's a lot of focus on privacy and the way that some of these big data companies are using personal data, often in ways that no government would ever be able to do. So that's the kind of backdrop, and why these headline grabbing figures about penalties sort of attract so much attention. And that's at one end of the scale. For businesses like yours and ours, it's a different, obviously what I've just been saying doesn't kind of quite fit to the sort of scenarios that I'm sure you and I sort of come across in our everyday lives. But nonetheless, these new rules apply, from the Facebooks and Googles of this world right down to the one-man bands and everything in between. Obviously, how the law or how the rules are applied to businesses depends very much on the sort of business and what it does with data. So it's very much a case of horses for courses, but the main point is these rules apply to a greater or lesser extent to everyone. Article 83 of the GDPR emphasises that where somebody doesn't comply with the rules and the authorities intend imposing a fine, they will take certain factors into account in determining the level of the fine. So the nature and gravity of the infringement is going to be relevant. So, Facebook and its 50 million data subjects is going to be a very different thing to where, 2 or 3 individuals' data gets into the wrong hands. The actions taken by the company to mitigate the damage and to make sure that anybody who's affected by a data breach is aware of it and is able to take protective action, and the degree of intentional or negligent infringement. And this is kind of really worth noting, because businesses that try to do the right thing will be in a much stronger position if something goes wrong than those who just haven't bothered, just sort of think, oh, well, it's not really for us, I've got other more important things to deal with, I don't think it's important. Those people with that sort of attitude will find that the authorities clamp down much more severely, at whatever level the infringement is. And this is kind of emphasised by a new principle of accountability which the GDPR introduces. So not only have businesses got to comply with the laws, the new laws, but they've got to be able to demonstrate that they comply. So I think in whatever you do going forward in terms of trying to comply with the new rules, I think it's important that you keep records of what you're doing, so that if ever anyone, if ever you have a data breach, if ever anyone complains about your sort of approach to privacy, you've got some sort of way of demonstrating what you're doing and how you're seeking to comply. Quite often I get asked about, well, does GDPR really matter because we're leaving the EU and this is an EU piece of legislation? I think the short answer is forget about Brexit for these purposes. The principles introduced by GDPR are here to stay. There's still a little bit of uncertainty as to exactly how things are going to apply once we've left the EU. But I think the principles in GDPR is the way forward, is the future, and I think not only for the UK and for the EU, but I think over time you will find that sort of pretty much the rest of the world all goes in the same direction. This is the direction of travel, and so you might as well get on board sooner rather than later. You know, the final point, everybody is getting more and more serious about privacy, and the fact that you know, the recent news about Facebook is just bringing it increasingly to the attention of the general public. And you know, you get all this stuff about the enthusiasm for people deleting their Facebook accounts and so on. People are becoming much more savvy about their privacy, and that's only going to increase. So the businesses that get that message and communicate with their customers that actually your personal information does matter, and we as a business want to treat it, we want to be responsible and treat it the right way and look after it. I think those businesses are going to be the winners, and the ones that you know, stay in the dark ages and think that personal information doesn't matter are, you know, going to find themselves very much behind the times. So I thought just to kick off with, it'd be useful just to highlight the main principles that are set out in the GDPR. These really build on what's already the law under the Data Protection Act, although there are a few tweaks. But I think it's really important going back to basics, because if you sort of haven't taken on board these key principles, then I think you're starting not from sort of a solid foundation. So I think you need to bear these principles in mind in terms of whatever you do with personal data that you hold.
Can I just ask,
Yeah, sure.
When we don't have access to this presentation, so we don't have to...
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. These are the key principles which any business which is handling personal data must comply with, and if you don't comply with these, you are sort of effectively, you know, in breach of the law. What that will actually mean, it may not mean anything until somebody complains, or there's a data breach, or that there's some other instance which you know, shines a spotlight on your practices. But I think it's, you know, prevention is so much better than cure in these situations. And also I think, and hopefully it will sort of become clear as the morning goes on, I think if you really sort of embrace these principles and use that use these principles to sort of underpin what you do as a business, I think that there are sort of business benefits to be gained. So just running through these, personal data, and by personal data I mean any sort of data which identifies a living individual. So it can be really simple information like names, addresses, email addresses, telephone numbers, or it can range to far more sort of sensitive or confidential information, so information about a person's health, physical or mental health, religious beliefs, political views and so on. Now I appreciate that for most of your businesses, probably most of the information that you will hold will be sort of fairly low level sort of information, for example customer information, you know, for marketing lists and so on. But also remember you'll have things like employee information, which may include, for example, you know, information in about your employees' health, you know, sick notes or medical records or whatever. And obviously that sort of information does need looking after particularly carefully, because you know, goes without saying, and this is not kind of new as a result of GDPR, but GDPR just highlights the fact that you do need to be extra careful with information that is of a sensitive nature. Interestingly enough, financial information on its own, which is not, financial information, obviously if it can be connected to an individual, a customer or whatever, is personal data and clearly needs to be looked after. If you have say payment card details which don't actually, from which you can't identify a customer, that is not personal data per se, so it doesn't fall within these rules, but nonetheless it clearly needs to be looked after carefully. So personal data needs to be processed lawfully, fairly and transparently, and I'll talk in a minute about what lawful processing means, because again it's another important thing to get your head round. It needs to be processed in a fair manner, and it needs to be processed transparently. And transparency is a really important thing under GDPR. So it's really important where you are dealing with someone's personal data that you communicate with them so that they're clear and understand what it is that you're collecting and what it is you're doing with it, and also sort of how long you're doing it, whether you're sharing it and so on. So transparency is something that's really important to kind of hold on to. You need to collect the data for specified, explicit and legitimate purposes, and it needs to be adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary and kept accurate and up to date. So all of those second, third and fourth bullet points, and actually the fifth one as well, kept in a form which permits identification for no longer than is necessary. All of those bullet points really highlight the fact that personal data is something that you should regard as something that you should kind of limit as much as you can. The old idea that you just collect all sorts of information and hold on to it forever is kind of old school thinking. Now you need to take the approach that actually, what do I really need in order to do what I need to do? What's superfluous? What do I really not need? And make a real distinction and keep limit what you collect and use and the length of period that you keep it for to a minimum, not just keep stuff sort of on the possibility that you might need it at some stage. So I think that's a big shift. And also this idea that you should only keep it for as long as is necessary, and that always raises a lot of questions like, well, how long is necessary? And that very much depends on the individual situation. But I think you need to recognise that everyone needs to move away from the idea that you just collect masses of stuff and just keep it forever. That is not the way forward. And finally, it needs to be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data. Obviously, IT security has a big part to play in this, but equally, even with paper records, you need to make sure that they're kept secure and don't sort of leave stuff lying around that could get into the wrong hands. So it's kind of quite obvious and basic in a way. You've got to process lawfully, you've got to tell people what you're doing, you've got to limit the amount of processing that you're doing, and keep it to a sort of the real essentials, and keep it secure. So that's what it is in a nutshell, and if you do those things you should be fine. Sounds simple. The other thing just to say is obviously over the coming months businesses will need to make changes to the way that they operate in order to take account of the new rules. It's fair to say that no one will be 100% compliant by the 25th of May, and probably going forward it's very difficult to say that anyone would ever be 100% compliant. this is very much a sort of risk management issue, and the important thing is to identify the issues in your business where personal data has a role to play, to identify where you may not be compliant with the law at the moment, to identify the real risk issues for your business and to take steps to tackle those. But it's unlikely that you're ever going to be 100% perfect, but it is a case of identifying the big risks and trying to reduce those as much as you can. And this comes back to the point I made at the beginning about the authorities looking at the approach that you've taken. So if they can see that you've tried to identify the risks and tried to take appropriate action, then you should be in a much stronger position. One sort of possibly helpful way of thinking about data protection is it's almost like health and safety for personal data. And so if you think sort of by way of comparison, with traditional health and safety, it affects different businesses in different ways. If you're a construction company, it's a big issue and you're going to spend a lot of money on it because it goes to the heart of your operations. If you're an office-based business, yes, you've got to do a little bit of basic health and safety, make sure there's not stuff that people can trip over, have a first aider and so on, but it's going to be on a much different scale. And the same sort of thing applies in relation to personal data. For the big companies whose business is really predicated on large-scale use of personal data, there's going to be a lot more for them to do, and they will have been preparing for the GDPR for some time. At the other end of the scale, where the amount of data that you're using is relatively modest and you're using it in relatively modest ways, then yes, there will be something to do, but it's not going to be on the same scale. So it is very much a case of horses for courses. So coming back to this point about lawful processing, and the reason that I'm sort of going to go through this in a bit of detail is that before you can begin to work out what you might need to do in order to comply with the GDPR, you have to have a handle on the basis on which you're processing personal data, because if you haven't got one of these grounds for processing personal data, then you shouldn't be doing it. It's also important that you identify the basis on which you are processing personal data, because slightly different considerations apply depending on which ground you're relying on. So you have to ask yourself the question in relation to every sort of category of personal data that you collect. So, for example, your employee information, your customer information, your marketing information, your information from suppliers. You have to think in relation to all of those and any others. What data have I got and why am I using it? And the why question needs to have an answer which falls within one of these categories. And if you can't answer the why question with one of these, then basically you haven't got a basis for processing personal data and you need to kind of stop and think again. So firstly, you're processing personal data to perform a contract. So the obvious example is you've got a customer, they place an order with you. Clearly you need their personal, some information from them, whether it's a business or an individual, you'll need some information from them in order to perform the contract. So clearly you can use their personal information in that scenario. Or you need it to comply with a legal obligation. So as an employer, you'll have to account to HMRC and other authorities in relation to your employees' tax, national insurance and so on. There isn't a contract there. You haven't necessarily got the employee's consent, but you've got a legal duty to do that stuff. So obviously, again, you're fine to do that. The next one is to protect a data subject's vital interests, and I think the easiest way of kind of describing this is basically you're doing something to save someone's life or do something quite dramatic, so you don't need to worry about whether or not they consent to you telling them that telling someone that they live at 6 Acacia Avenue or whatever. You're doing it because they need to go and tell their wife or do something to save their life, so that's fine. You need it to perform a task in the public interest, unlikely to apply to anyone here. That's really for sort of public sector activity. You have a legitimate interest to process the personal data, or you're processing the data with the data subject's consent. And these last two are a bit sort of less straightforward. Legitimate interest is quite a useful ground for processing personal data, because you can do it without getting the consent of the data subject, and I'll talk in more detail in a moment about consent, because one of the changes under GDPR is that the rules on consent have been significantly tightened up. So in some situations it will be sort of desirable to be able to say, well, I'm relying on legitimate interest rather than consent, because in that scenario, where you're relying on legitimate interest, you can just do it rather than have to ask whether you can do it. So it's a case of sort of telling somebody you're doing something rather than asking them if it's okay to do it, which obviously can kind of slow down the process. However, there are limits on legitimate interest, and in particular it should only be used where it's kind of essential, or where your interests are sort of significantly greater than those of the data subject. So the area that most people get exercised about legitimate interest versus consent is in the area of marketing. And there are different views about this, and there's no sort of hard and fast rules. But I think from a lawyer's perspective, I would say, in order to send marketing material to individuals, you're safer to rely on consent, because it's much more black and white. You ask them, do you want to receive marketing stuff from us? They say yes. You keep a record of it, and there's then sort of little or no debate. With legitimate interest, there's much more uncertainty as to whether or not that's something that you should be doing and how far you can go with it. So legitimate interest has a role to play, and we can talk a bit more about this distinction between legitimate interest and consent in relation to marketing. I'm sure it's something that Edwin's going to be talking about as well. But I think you need to be aware of the fact that there is this question over to what extent can you rely on legitimate interest as a basis for using information to market to people. Now, consent under the Data Protection Act is a concept, but it was kind of quite woolly and was basically getting abused. And so the GDPR has tightened up these rules, and part of this, and probably I should have said earlier, is a lot of the changes under GDPR are to give individual data subjects much more control of their data, for them to understand what information is being held about them, and to give them options as to whether or not that data is held or used or deleted or so on. And so consent, as part of this idea of giving data subjects control, this tightening up of the consent rules is sort of part and parcel of that. And so now, if you want to rely on consent as your basis for processing personal data, you've got to meet some much more rigorous standards. So the consent must be freely given, it must be specific, informed and unambiguous. So freely given means that the person has to, then there shouldn't be any conditions attached to it. So, for example, where somebody is selling online, they shouldn't be, the sales process shouldn't be conditional on someone having to be forced to tick a yes box to receive other marketing material. The customer should be able to buy whatever they're wanting there and then without having to be forced to receive other marketing information. It must be specific, so the consent needs, where a data subject is giving consent, they need to be clear as to what it is that they're consenting to, not just a kind of blanket, yes, please send me marketing material about everything that you do. They should be given options so that they can kind of pick and choose what they want to consent to or not consent to, as the case may be. The consent needs to be informed, so it's important that when someone's been invited to give consent, that they're given some basic information so that they understand what they're being asked about, what the data will be used for. And the consent needs to be unambiguous, so gone are the days of things like pre-tick boxes or phraseology where you've got to read it 2 or 3 times because there's double negatives and the person might not know whether they're saying yes or no. It needs to be a really clear question, and the person's consent must be, involve a clear, unambiguous positive action by the data subject. So, ticking a box or inserting their email address or something like that is the way forward. And as I touched on earlier, because these new rules on consent mean that it is more difficult to obtain consent in the first place, it does kind of raise the question, is processing based on consent appropriate or essential? Because actually, if one of those other bases for processing will apply in your particular scenario, then my advice would be go with that rather than consent, simply because you've got these extra hoops that you've got to jump through. So on the issue of consent, I've got a slide here with a number of practical issues that you need to think about when you are obtaining consent from someone. So the consent needs to be separate from, it shouldn't be something that's buried in some terms and conditions on your website or any other sort of terms and conditions. It needs to be something that's quite prominent. There's got to be an active opt-in by the data subject. There needs to be a clear statement of consent. The Information Commissioner's Office has a lot of guidance on the issue of consent, and one of the things they talk about is granular options. So where you're inviting someone to sign up to email marketing, it's a good idea, rather than just say, do you want to receive marketing information from us, better to say, would you like, and then give them a number of options so they can say, yes, I'm interested in this, no, I'm not interested in that, so they can pick and choose. And again, this gives people much greater feeling of control, or does give them greater control. Where you're intending to share information with third parties, gone are the days, and it may be that this is not something that's really relevant to you, but where data is shared with third parties, gone are the days of being able to say, please agree to us sharing your information with trusted third parties or something vague like that. That's not giving enough information to the individual. So now you've got to actually name the people that you're going to share data with. It must be easy for the data subject to withdraw consent, and so both at the time that you collect the consent and in the communications that you send them, as well as giving them options, for example, to update their preferences, it should also be clear how they can just completely unsubscribe to whatever it is that you're sending them. And that information should be provided at the outset and provided in anything else that you send to them, so that they can easily access a method of withdrawing consent. And so, as I say, individuals have more rights over their data now, and so as part of this business about getting consent, it's important that you keep up-to-date records of the consents that you've got. So if you have a marketing database, there should ideally be some kind of way of recording when people signed up to it, and also if they unsubscribe, you need to have some kind of record that they've unsubscribed, and make sure that they don't those names don't accidentally find their way back onto the mailing list. And as I say, the Information Commissioner's office has lots of information. A lot of people tell me there's far too much information on there, and I would agree that if you're just kind of wanting an overview, you might kind of feel like you're drowning in the amount of stuff that's there. But if you've got a specific question that you sort of need the answer to, you probably find it somewhere there. They've also got a section on preparing for GDPR for smaller businesses, which might be worth a look to. So as I touched on earlier, individual data subjects have increased rights under the GDPR. They had a number of rights under the Data Protection Act, but the GDPR introduces a number of new rights. Many of these won't necessarily be terribly relevant to your businesses, but I think I've just kind of listed them there to just highlight the fact that there are a lot more rights, and over time, I think, and particularly, with all the kind of stuff that's in the news about Facebook, I think people are becoming more and more savvy about privacy, and it'll be interesting to see once the GDPR comes in how many people actually, get a taste for exercising their rights and becoming more proactive in looking after their own privacy. So some of these rights already exist, things like the right to have access to the personal data that you hold about them. That's a right that already exists, and that's going to continue. So there's the right to be informed. So as I said earlier, it's important that whether you're processing on the basis of consent or you're processing on any other basis, it's important that you communicate with individuals so that they understand what it is that you're collecting and what you're doing with it. So for most businesses, the way of doing that will be to have a privacy policy on your website, which explains in sort of nice, clear English, so that people don't need a law degree in order to kind of understand what it is that's being said. Just really kind of simple stuff that anybody going on the website can get a quick idea as to what it is that you're doing. So right to be informed is really important. As I say, this right to have access to the information you hold. Now, I suspect that for many of your businesses, the most likely sort of candidates for requesting access will be employees or ex-employees, and I think in the past it's tended to be this right of access has tended to be exercised usually where someone's sort of got some sort of more general grudge against you, maybe an ex-employee who's bringing a claim, and so they decide to make a data subject access request as well to see if there's anything that you haven't disclosed in the course of the correspondence relating to the claim that might be kind of useful. So that sort of right still exists. There's also the right to have information that you hold about an individual rectified, or in some cases completely deleted. and there's been a lot of kind of talk in the press about this right to be forgotten. It's not an absolute right, because you might have good grounds for needing to keep that information. So, for example, coming back to the example of the disgruntled employee, they might decide, right, I want all my data that you're holding about me deleted. And you might say, well, actually, I need to keep at least some of that, because I need, you know, for sort of tax and financial sort of reasons, I need to keep information about the payroll information and so on. I need to keep that for, you know, an extended period of time. So therefore, you know, the right to have it deleted is not an absolute right. These are the rights down at on the bottom half of that list are probably more relevant to where you've got a lot of kind of large scale data processing, rather than probably the sort of processing that you would be doing day to day. But as I say, it's just to highlight the fact that the GDPR does really seek to empower individuals. I've got a slide here just about controllers and processors, to highlight or remind you of the fact that under existing data protection legislation and going forward, you have these two concepts of a data controller and a data processor. In most scenarios where you're processing information, say about your employees or your customers or your people on your marketing database, you'll be the data controller, and you'll be sort of collecting, processing the data, doing everything with it, and you won't be sharing it with anyone else. But there may be instances where you are using a third party, or you engage a third party to do something for you, and in the course of that relationship, they're processing personal data for you. So an obvious example is where you use a payroll company. So you're providing your employees, you know, details, payroll information to a payroll company in order that they can do the payroll. And in that situation, that will be a controller-processor relationship. And under the GDPR, there are new rules about those relationships. And in particular, there needs to be a written contract in place to make sure that the processor complies with a number of obligations, so that notwithstanding the fact that you're outsourcing the data to a third party, the data will be protected just as much as if you were doing the payroll in-house in my example. And it's likely, I suspect, for the businesses here today that where you do use a third-party processor like a payroll company, you know, with a bit of luck, they will already have processes in place for dealing with these new requirements. But it's something you need to be aware of, and you need to, if you do use a payroll company, for example, you do need to be talking to them and making sure that they're going to have something in place to deal with this written contract requirement before the 25th of May. Then this is just a slide that I copied from the ICO's website, which is just a kind of checklist of some of the things to be thinking about. And I've probably touched on most of those that are relevant to you, but it is just a quick way of kind of highlighting the different sort of strands to this whole process. One of the things I haven't talked about already is where you have a data breach. Now, hopefully that won't happen to you, because you will, over the next few months, tighten up your the amount of data processing that you're doing, keep it to a minimum. You will make sure that your staff are sort of properly trained and understand what they should and shouldn't be doing in terms of looking after people's personal data. If you're using third parties such as payroll companies, you'll be making sure that they're on side, and hopefully your IT and other sort of security systems will be sort of, you know, adequate. However, the worst case scenario, something happens and you do have a data breach, you need to be aware that in certain circumstances that will need to be reported to the ICO, who may sort of investigate or take action. And in certain circumstances, you may also need to tell the individual data subjects. In a nutshell, I mean, I think it's quite, whether or not a breach needs to be reported does very much depend on the facts. And if you get yourself into a situation where you have a data breach, you may want to take advice before running off to the ICO. The important thing to be aware, however, is that breaches need to be, where they do need to be reported, they need to be done as soon as possible, and ideally within 72 hours. And where you think that a data subject's information has been compromised, for example, if you discover that some credit card details have kind of got into the wrong hands, then that's the sort of thing that you would want to be telling the data subject, because they might need to phone up their credit card company or whatever to tell them that these details have kind of got lost and so on. So, you know, fingers crossed it's not something that will happen to you, but I think you do need to be aware that if it does happen, you've got to be sort of, you know, getting a move on and doing something sort of pretty quickly. You can't hang around. And the other thing to say is, where you do have a concern about something, on the whole, it's better to fess up and speak to the ICO than kind of bury it, because if it is something significant, but you hide it, if it ever does get out into the open, you'll have simply compounded the situation by not, dealing with it the right way. But, you know, I suspect that, you know, hopefully more likely than not, the sort of data breaches that you might ever have would hopefully be things that wouldn't require reporting. But as I say, if in doubt, take advice, or if really in doubt, speak to the ICO. So what should you be doing next? As I think I've probably sort of already highlighted, just doing nothing is not an option. Whatever sort of business you are, you have to do something. And exactly what you do will depend a bit on what sort of personal data you've got and what you do with it. But you can't really make decisions about any changes that you need to make until you have a thorough understanding of where you are at the moment. So for all the clients that we're talking to about this subject, we sort of begin by saying you need to do some sort of data audit to assess where you are at the moment. So you need to be kind of, and you know, we sort of suggest clients use some sort of spreadsheets to kind of list out sort of types of personal, and maybe, for example, have a spreadsheet dealing with customer personal data, another spreadsheet dealing with employee personal data, another one dealing with personal data that you hold on a marketing database. And for each of those, on each spreadsheet, have a list of questions. So what sort of personal data do you hold? So, you know, is it names, addresses, other types of stuff? Where is it held? And that may be in multiple locations, both paper records and on your IT system. Why have you got it? Which comes back to this, where did it come from? So did it come from the data subject direct, or did it come through some other means? Why do you need it? So that's the what's your lawful basis for processing question. What else? How long do you keep it for? Do you share it with anyone? And once you've kind of collected that information together and got a better picture of where you are at the moment, I think then if you go back to those key principles, particularly around have we got too much data? Are we keeping it for longer than we need? You can then start to break it down and start thinking about, well, actually, we do have, you know, customer information in a lot of different places. Do we actually need it? We've got it on different people's laptops. Could we not just have it in one central place and everyone just has access into that one central place? So I think working through that kind of audit process will then help you to identify things where you might want to make some changes. And I think also the beauty of trying to do this through having some spreadsheets, for example, is that you then create a bit of an audit trail. So you can kind of, your sort of snapshot to begin with is this is what we've got, and we've, got customer records going back for however many years. I had talking to a firm of estate agents who'd been on the go for 37 years and they'd never deleted a single customer record. So they had details going back for 37 years. So they realised that maybe actually they could get rid of some of that stuff. So once you, and so if you've got information captured in a spreadsheet, and then you can have a column at the end where you kind of sort of record your sort of decision-making process, and then you can kind of have some actions, and then you can tick off when you've, deleted old data or whatever. And that, is then begins to create an audit trail, which, coming back to the principle of accountability that I spoke about earlier on, that would be, sort of ideal information to demonstrate what changes that you've made to try and tighten up your privacy practices. So yeah, I've really sort of touched on the next bit. So once you've got your audit, you review the results of the audit, you make decisions, you might want to seek advice on particular aspects, and decide what is and isn't feasible. And then once you've done that, implement the changes and record what changes you've made. And then there may be a bit of updating of documentation that's necessary. So, for example, looking at your privacy policy, you might want to have an internal sort of data protection section. If you've got like a sort of office manual or some other sort of operations manual that all the staff use, you might want to update that to explain to them a bit more about how you want to how you want the business to look after and deal with personal data going forward. You might want to do a bit of staff training. If you've got standard terms and conditions, you might want to have a look at if there's anything in there about data protection that you think needs updating. If you're using third parties, for example, payroll companies, you need to kind of get onto them and find out what they're doing about these controller processor contract requirements. So there'll be sort of bits and pieces to do on the sort of documentation side. And, although we're now sort of less than 2 months away from 25th of May, I suspect that for most of your businesses, with a bit of effort, you should have made good progress by the deadline date. However, I think, being realistic for most businesses, this will be an ongoing process, and that, it will sort of continue beyond the 25th of May. But I think the important thing is that you are at least making strides towards, getting as compliant as you can be with GDPR ahead of the 25th of May. I appreciate after saying, please ask me questions, I've kind of stunned you all into silence, so I'm sorry about that. If you'd like to ask any questions on the points I've touched on, please feel free to do so either now or after Edwin's slot. Or as Edwin's talking, if you want. Yeah.
Access to information. Can an employee ask to see content trainers' notes about this, disciplinary meetings? Yeah. And one thing that, obviously, if it's notes, sort of formal notes about a meeting, that, I'm not an employment lawyer, but I'm sure that, keeping a sort of good and accurate record of that type of meeting is a good idea. However, on the flip side, I think as employers, you need to be careful about just kind of casual conversations by email particularly about employees, because that's the sort of thing that could, or ought to be sort of disclosed as part of a subject access request. So, verbal's often better in those sort of situations, and just keeping the sort of written stuff to the formal stuff that you need to keep, and also you would be, you know, quite happy for anyone to see. I think it's the kind of casual things that you shoot off in an email that, you know, maybe best just saved for verbal conversation.
How does that tie in then with email addresses? Because obviously a lot of customers contact us by email.
Yeah.
And we may just reply like if it's a sales inquiry.
Yes.
How are we,
Yeah.
it's kind of harder to keep control of that. I can see for lists of things it's easy, or loyalty clubs, you know, you've got
Yeah.
a specific list.
Yeah.
For people who just make inquiries by email, where does that fit into the law?
Well, you're going to, so as part of your audit process, I guess you need to be thinking about where is personal information held, and so you're going to have to identify your email system as being one area, one place where it's held. There's nothing wrong with obviously exchanging emails for customer inquiries. You know, it's kind of what you need to do. You know, this law is not intended to stop people doing what they need to do, but I think you do need to kind of ask yourself, well, firstly, you know, is our email secure? How long do our you know, what's our sort of retention policy for emails? When do they get deleted? Is there information that would be in an email that actually would be usefully transposed into, if you've got like a sort of some sort of sales or CRM system or something, you might actually want to store the key bits of contact information in that separate system, so that then you don't need to keep loads of emails for a long period of time. So there's no hard and fast rules, and sometimes, particularly with email, you're kind of a bit constrained by what the technology will or won't allow you to do. And I know a lot of businesses, you know, just have all sorts of information stored in email, and you know, to a certain extent, you know, that's inevitable. But I think that if you can sort of maybe try and have things sort of broken down a little bit, so that the key bits of information that you really need to keep for possibly a longer period of time and maybe somewhere other than the general email, then it makes it easier for you to implement policies to get rid of, you know, the general email sort of stuff quicker. Yeah.
Who's actually going to police all this data? Every business in the UK has to do this. It needs an army to make sure. Well,
it's a very valid question. Obviously, the Information Commissioner's office is the UK authority. They won't be going round checking up whether people are doing things. They will only get involved where something is notified to them, either by the company in question because they know that they've messed up, or by a data subject who complains. And whether, you know, even when something is brought to their attention, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go and check. It's going to be either a situation that seems particularly serious, or where there have been multiple complaints against the same business. But I think that, you know, kind of thinking, oh, well, no one's ever going to check us, isn't really a sort of attitude that I would advocate. You know, the law is going to be what it is, and I think that over time consumers will end up voting with their feet and go with the businesses who are taking privacy seriously, and those that aren't, I think, will ultimately sort of get left behind. But you know, it is, as I said earlier in that sort of health and safety analogy, what you do has got to be proportionate, and no one's expecting you know, sort of small and medium-sized businesses to be doing things that are going to be so disproportionate to their activity that, you know, they kind of basically put themselves out of business. But, you know, as I say, I think everyone's got to do something, and it's a judgment call for every business as to what they feel is appropriate for their particular situation. But I think you do need to do something, and I would certainly recommend that you document what you're doing so that you've got at least some kind of backup if something does happen and someone comes along and says, well, what have you been doing? You say, well, I've been doing this actually.
just want to ask some questions on consent. So, for example, now our data system is already mainly held up of existing loyalty members. So obviously they've filled out a form, given their email address, ticked boxes about sales, Christmas trees. We haven't got, we've put that in, they've joined our loyalty system, but we haven't kept copies of that form. We've processed it, put it in. So they've obviously given consent because they've joined the loyalty. So do we now, from point tomorrow, do we say that everyone that joins from tomorrow, for example, we have to keep a copy of that form they filled in, so they've given consent? Or do we have to contact everyone that's on our loyalty and say, well, actually, if you don't respond to an email by saying you opt in, then really we're going to stop communication with you? And you know, do you say in terms of the whole point where you said what was it, legitimate
interest versus consent?
Versus that, is that where you can put that into the old ones into that bracket, and the new ones into the new bracket?
There isn't a, you know, typical lawyer's answer. There isn't a sort of hard and fast rule, and every business has got to kind of, you know, take a view on what's right for them, and where the, you know, where the kind of sensible solution lies. I certainly think in relation to your specific question, going forward, I think you do need to be getting opt-in consent from new people. In terms of your historic database, the ICO's advice is that businesses should be seeking to refresh consents and get everybody that's already on the database opted in under the new rules. However, I know a lot of people have reservations about this, and there are a lot of businesses who over the last few months have been trying to get people opted in through this, and, you know, doing waves of emails to try and get more people in. But I know from our own business, for example, we sort of went down that line because we thought, well, that's what the ICO's kind of recommendation is. But it's easier said than done, and you do get a lot of people who don't respond. And, you know, there's only so many times you can kind of keep sending these emails, and, you know, we're getting closer and closer to the 25th of May, and we've sort of now taken the view that, well, I think we've done maybe 3 waves of emails, and we're kind of now thinking, well, the people who haven't responded and have the ones who said unsubscribe me, bin them, obviously the ones that have said yes, they're good for the new database, but we've got this big sort of mass of people in the middle, and what do you do with them? So I think our next step is going to be for individual contacts within our business to try contacting those people individuals as a last kind of blast. And then I think after that we're just going to have to can those people who still haven't responded. Now, for our business, that's not necessarily that significant, because we don't do a lot of email marketing and stuff anyway, so not the end of the world. But where your marketing activity is a more significant part of your business development, you might want to take a different approach. And so, for example, if you are satisfied that even though the consent that was originally given might not meet these, well, first of all, you might say, well, even though we got that consent at a time before we knew about GDPR, actually, what sort of shape is that consent in? Because if the only means by which those people have got onto our database was that they actually sent us their email address and kind of asked to subscribe to it somehow, even though you might say, well, it doesn't tick all the GDPR consent boxes, it was still something that the person consciously did. They haven't kind of got on there by accident. So you might take the view, well, actually, we take the view that is a database of people that we can still effectively market to. We'll make sure that we update our privacy policy. We'll make sure that everything that we send to those people makes it clear that they can unsubscribe, that anything that we send to them, you know, gives them options to update their preferences. And, you know, we're going to take a kind of calculated risk that that's the best way forward for us. However, if you said to me, actually, there's a load of people on that list that we got from some third party and they possibly don't really want our information, then that might be the decision that comes out of that might be a slightly different one. So it's very much a case of looking at the facts and thinking, well, given what given what the GDPR consent requirements are and given the kind of spirit of what we're trying to achieve here, do we think that what we're proposing doing is a realistic and sensible thing to do? And even if it is not 100% compliant, do we think that it's kind of a low risk kind of issue? I think the privacy policy is quite an important aspect to what you're doing, because it's a way of communicating to those people who haven't that aren't the sort of part of the new GDPR opt-in sort of group. It's a way of kind of communicating with those people about what you're doing historically. So that might be a kind of a sort of solution rather than going down the ICO's route of emailing everybody. I mean, there's still nothing to stop you. We're still 2 months out. You might want to have a go at trying to get some opted in, but I wouldn't sort of hold your breath that you're going to have a huge response rate.
So is it asking people whether they're doing it the other way around and saying, if you want to opt out, let us know?
That's don't do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Coming on from that, so we, like other businesses, have historically sent out catalogues over the years, and after a period of 5 or 6 years, with no contact, we stopped sending catalogues. And when we take information from a customer, we'll take an email address and a phone number and the address and so forth. And have in recent years said, we will send you mail-outs, and periodically we do mail-outs.
Yeah.
And always link the two together, because we've sent them a physical catalogue, we send them an email periodically. As long as we're not taking third-party information that we've hoovered up from wherever, and we have the opportunity to unsubscribe, and we've cleaned up our database, that would fulfil the criteria that is required now.
I think so. So the people... Sorry.
Because like everybody else, you send out lots of emails saying, hey, we'd like you to tick to say you're going to continue receiving emails. Surprisingly, very few people will bother ticking it. They'll just go, I don't like you, junk.
Yeah.
And then that solves the problem forever.
So that in your particular case, the emails and the catalogues that you send out are sent to people who, how did they sign?
Them by email, no longer by letter, but by email or by phone.
Right. Okay. I suppose the it is this kind of dilemma of in an ideal world you'd get them to resubscribe, but reality is kind of quite some way apart from that. And actually, if they're receiving information from you, you are sort of pretty confident that the only people that you've got on there are people who asked for it in the first place, and provided that you give them an option to unsubscribe, you may conclude that for your business that's a reasonable approach to take. What's the other thing I was going to say? I guess that there's the issue about if somebody originally, say, contacted you, telephoned you for a catalogue, and you put them on the mailing list, you might have a bit of an issue if you said, well, how are you going to demonstrate that they also wanted to receive emails? And they might not like receiving emails, but I think if so long as they've always got the option to update their preferences or to unsubscribe, that's a big bonus, obviously. And what was the other thing I was just going to say? Sorry, you ask your question.
But going forward, what you were saying, you have to have some sort of physical
reference
that said they actually said, I want to be on your mailing list.
I think
a physical catalogue,
and an email, because
or
they're
anything else.
yeah, exactly. And with your emails, for example, I don't know exactly what you do, but with your emails, for example, you might want to give them options so that they, I don't know, they have information about I don't know,
Product A, product B.
yeah, exactly, yeah, so that no, it shouldn't be. I think it's counterproductive to have too many options. I would say no more than half a dozen at the most, because otherwise people just kind of get fed up and think, oh, I can't be bothered going through this great long list. But at the same time, you know, maybe 3 or 4 options of just core different areas that they could have information about. I think that is helpful to people, because they might be interested in that, but they're not interested in that, and so they, you know, they might get fed up if you're sending them stuff about something they're not interested in. The other point I know that you were saying earlier was that you had people on your existing database that you'd had details of from a number of years ago. And I do think, and you know, it's going to, everybody's got to sort of, you know, make their own decisions on this, but I do think there's a need to look at how long you're keeping people on mailing lists, and particularly if you have some visibility as to, particularly with emails, for example, whether people are actually, you know, opening emails and so on, and trying to be a bit more active in database management and getting rid of the sort of dormant people. And that applies both online and offline, that the people who you think and, you know, and just not engaging with your business, you need to be thinking about, well, what can we do to trim those people off so that we've got a database of kind of more active kind of customers, which, you know, as well as kind of having I think being useful from a legal GDPR perspective, I think just also makes good business sense, because there's no point having 50 million people on your database if only 1 million are actually interested in getting your stuff. So, you know, it just kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
And lots of software, MailChimp and stuff like that, are already doing
Yeah.
bits and pieces of it for you.
Yeah.
But so what you're saying is, old school, somebody phones up and says, can you send me a catalogue, here's my address, is not good enough consent.
Yeah, no, I think if you, I mean, I can't tell you how to kind of, you know, run your operations, but
if email, you're saying, well, you can get a tick box and you can have a reference for that, and you keep that reference filed away. But if somebody phones you up and says,
yeah,
can you send me some information?
Yeah. But say when, and as I say, you know, this is kind of getting into really sort of nitty-gritty operational stuff, and far be it from me to tell you how to run your business. But if, for example, someone phones up and says, can I have a catalogue? You can say, yeah, you're obviously going to have to take their name and address. You say, would you like me to ask them if they want anything by email, see if you can get their email address as well, and then you can send them an email afterwards to say, catalogue's on its way, would you also like to subscribe to our email newsletters or whatever. And that has the dual purpose of, one, trying to get them engaged online, and also you've then got a documentary record of the fact that they've asked for a catalogue, something like that. I'm not saying do it like that, but it's just an idea as to the ways you can do things.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I guess you can add them to your database as well, even if you don't want to respond with a forwarding email to say, so in that phone call you would say, can I add you to our database? And if they say yes, you have a tick list on your database and then
But I have no physical, you know, I can't. It'd be difficult then to go back and prove to somebody that that's exactly.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could in the most basic way. You could just have like a little notebook or something where you record the names of the people who ask for, or you know, you have some little record of everybody that you've sent a catalogue to in response to a telephone request or something like that. So, I think the difficulty is that you don't want to have too many sort of little sets of information, because as I say, one of the key things with GDPR is trying to streamline what you're doing and avoid having duplicated information and it all being a bit sort of bitty. I think that you know, depends on how you kind of record information, but I think if you've got one sort of central system that can capture as much of this information as possible, then I think the better. But you know, I appreciate that, you know, sometimes these IT sort of solutions are easier said than done.
who might just be about to answer my question before I've even asked it. Our customer database, we're a trade nursery, so customers have to sign up with us in order, then we keep a copy of that, so we're kind of already compliant with that. Their information then goes into the database. Within that sort of little box on the computer, the tick box for receiving emails.
Right.
Which at the moment we don't use, but that's obviously the direction we're heading.
Yeah.
But you have said that you can send out an email to all your existing clients and saying, you know, would it be all right for us to use your information for, as this guy said, product A, product B, product C. But our database, we've only got one option to tick to email. So how then are we going to manage that? Is that import everything to Excel and then, because it seems like a lot of work.
Yeah.
To keep managing that, especially where it's, you know, you said we've got, what you said, it
Yeah.
says in the notes that we have to keep that updated. It means that basically the database that we use on a daily basis is pretty much going to become defunct.
Yeah. You know, I think this is where, you know, when you start getting into the nitty-gritty, that some of the challenges come, because you might get ideas of what you want to do and think, yeah, this would kind of work, and then you go to the IT and actually there's some elements of it that are not kind of quite so simple, and it's no good having a workaround if it's going to just slow up everything so much. So I think that where you have to come up with a solution which is not the ideal solution, I don't think anyone would be expecting you to come up with an alternative that is so kind of laborious and makes life so sort of difficult operationally that you just kind of, you know, grinding to a standstill. I think in that scenario you would be better to say the makeshift solution is to kind of carry on as we are, but we recognise that a change needs to be made, and we're going to keep this under review and see whether the software system is, you know, there's going to be any updates or whatever that can sort of get around that particular problem. Because I think if you end up with a kind of workaround that is just so complicated and maybe means that you've got data in multiple places, it doesn't necessarily seem like much of an improvement on maintaining the status quo in the short term. I don't know whether that helps or not, but it's the kind of general principle that, you know, I think that there's got to be a recognition that some things are, you know, not easy to do / impossible, and where you come up against that, you've got to come up with something that's a practical way forward. There's no point in just tying yourself up in knots in trying to do something that's, you know, just operationally sort of daft.
So the most sensible route that I can see at the moment is, when you were talking about the data audit, is to review what you're doing now, have a look at what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and as long as you can justify the decisions you're making,
you should be
then
okay.
You should be all right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. It's, you know, it's all very well me coming saying, you know, you've got to do all these things, but, you know, reality does kick in somewhere, and so long as you have done what you can, you've identified where there are problems, that you've made sort of, you know, the best decision that you can in difficult circumstances, and you don't just then, you know, stick your file away and never think about it again, keep it under review. You know, I would say at least every 12 months or possibly 6 monthly intervals, just to see if there's anything has changed. And that way, I would have thought you should be okay in terms of accountability.
Sorry, one other question. Obviously, we're running the business. We've got up to 10 people working under us. So there's one thing I set in the policy. What sort of tolerance is there if you have like road members of staff who just kind of go a little bit off? I mean, for example, a few years ago we had a couple of people who thought they were doing a great thing by signing customers up without getting them to fill in the forms, just to hurry orders through the system. And we stopped them at the time saying this isn't great for data protection because we've not got consent. Obviously, it's been ramped up another notch now. So what happens now if we're saying, well, on the whole, we're showing good practices, but we get reported by someone who's actually, well, how they end up in your system, and you can't display the fact they've given information.
Well, you know, the starting point, and obviously for owner-managed businesses, you've kind of got a bit of a head start in it's your business, and you can kind of, you know, dictate the rules going forward. But any business obviously is dependent upon its staff doing the right thing. And so as the leader of the business, you're the one who's got to, you know, do the audit, make the decisions and implement them as best you can. And obviously, you know, some clear instructions to staff. That's why I say some sort of, you know, if you've got an operations manual or something, having a little section on data protection's quite a good idea. Give them a bit of staff training. But beyond, you cannot control every individual within your business 24 hours a day, otherwise you'd be doing it yourself in the first place. The important thing is that you have sort of management procedures in place to mitigate or reduce the risks of the rogue employee going off and doing something. But that's not to say that risk's eliminated. You still get somebody doing something daft that, even though they were told this is the way that you do it, they kind of think they know better and go off and do it. You're not going to be, obviously, you know, it could cause an issue, but I think that you will be looked on far more leniently if it can be said that this is a kind of one-off by a rogue employee, and that's actually against a backdrop of a business that is trying to do the right thing, has thought about this, has got management processes in place to try and ensure that things are done right. And that's kind of quite different to a business where, you know, the management just doesn't care and there's kind of systemic kind of flouting of the rules.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Oh, there was one lady behind. I don't know. I'm maybe using up my time.
Do you want to ask later or?
I don't mind.
Well, I can do it now. I'm just.
It was just a very quick one.
Yeah.
We sell a lot of really big stuff, so the majority of our stuff we actually deliver. Obviously, we take the names and lists and put them into the EPOS system for the delivery to print out the delivery note. Should we be asking consent from people just for
No,
or does that count?
that's performing the contract. So where you've got your sort of CRM system for actually doing your business and dealing with your customers in that situation, you don't need to worry about consent, and you should steer away from consent. It's the only place, I think, where for your businesses where consent has a kind of role to play. But, you know, you've heard a bit of the discussion this morning about it is in relation to marketing. The other one of the final point just to mention in relation to consent is it may be worth you having a look at your employment contracts, because some businesses have traditionally relied on consent as a basis for processing employee information. And going forward, that's kind of not the thing to do, on the basis that there's sort of too much of an imbalance in the relationship between employer and employee, and that a consent by an employee isn't really freely given, so it doesn't meet GDPR standards. So going forward, there's plenty of other grounds for processing employee data, whether it's you know, you're fulfilling your obligations under your employment contract, whether you're you know, it's fulfilling a legal obligation, whether it's legitimate interest. There's plenty of other ways of processing employee data without relying on consent. So if you have got employment contracts that refer to consent, they just need a quick update.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So our next speaker is Edwin. Edwin is the founder of the online marketing agency Garden Connect. So I think that links in quite neatly with some of the questions that have just been asked.
I hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, the GDPR. I'm going to explain a couple of practical things about it to you the upcoming 2 hours. No, not 2 hours, 45 minutes. 45 minutes, no worries. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm one of the founders of Garden Connect. I started the company in 2002, and as you might hear on my accent, I try to be as British as you people, but I'm still from Amsterdam, while living close to Amsterdam. I'm the marketing director of Garden Connect, so you're open to ask me any technical questions you have, but I'm not sure if I can answer them. Well, I love to watch football, used to play it for 25 years. I also think, especially with my background, being in the online marketing and being in the garden industry, we're not GPs or doctors or working in the healthcare or insurance or whatever, so we can be serious, but we can still keep on smiling. Apart from working a lot, I also love to travel and I love to run, and you may have spotted me already, because this is me finishing the marathon in Barcelona 2 weeks ago. Well, then a brief overview of Garden Connect. As I said, we started in 2002. We currently work for over 250 garden centers in, obviously, the Netherlands, UK, Belgium, Ireland, and a few in the French part of Belgium, which are both independents and groups. We have a team of 35 developers, designers, and marketeers. And we try to do some sportive things. So we did a wipeout game last year with the team. And we've been in the UK since 2012. Well, we're an HTA member. We also work closely with Green Fingers. We built a National Plant Show website. I'm giving presentations at GLE, and we're a GCA member. So we try to be involved as much as possible in the UK industry. Well, then the GDPR. When I was being asked to give a presentation about this, I thought, well, it's by far the most boring subject I ever spoke about. Yeah, it's not sexy, but luckily Facebook helped me a little bit last week.
Could you just flip one?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Do you need to post next to it? I'll send you the presentation afterwards. It's fine.
Perfect.
You can make the photos if you want, but yeah, Facebook helped me a little bit because it's so obvious right now how much you can do with personal data, isn't it? Has anyone ever downloaded their Facebook profile? Have you ever tried that? Well, I did it. And Facebook stores everything you've ever done from the moment you signed up. So just everything, every login, everything. But then I was thinking, well, if Facebook is holding all the data for me, how much data is Google holding of me? Is anyone having an Android phone? Yeah, I assume a lot of people have an Android phone. Did you know Google stores the location where you are every time you open your phone, just unlocking it? So you can go to google.com/takeout, you can download your history, you can go to Google Maps, check your timeline, and not just doing something on Google, just grabbing your phone and unlocking it, that's it. Google saves your location. Well, I wasn't aware of that. I'm having an iPhone, I don't have the illusion Apple is not doing the same thing. But it gives you a lot of insight how those companies work, and they are that far that they can influence, well, the Brexit campaign or the Trump campaign or whatever campaign we're talking about. So it made me a lot more aware about personal data, and even after the latest crash, every Facebook profile, so yours, well, everyone who's having a Facebook profile, it's worth a little bit over $300. And that's not because you only look at the ads, it's also because they sell your data to third parties. Another example, what you can do with data, our Target figured out the teen girl was pregnant before her father did. You may have heard of this one before, but based on the purchases people make, if you buy specific products, and so you buy a specific lotion and specific fruits and veg, the chances are about 80% you're pregnant. Of course, it applies to women only. But that's something very straightforward you can do with data. Now, if we take a few steps back to the garden industry, just a random example. Well, what can we do with data in the garden center? Well, you sell beef in your restaurant. Just one of the dishes you have a loyalty card so you know who's buying your beef, don't you? It's something you can record. Well, then a survey showed that eating beef increases the risk of getting cancer by 17%. Don't you think an insurer would be interested to learn who's eating beef because they get a higher risk of getting cancer? But I don't think an insurer will call your business to ask you who's having beef, but think about the Tesco selling the data to an insurer. Well, that's interesting stuff to know. In other words, I think having more regulation in regards to privacy, personal data is pretty interesting, pretty useful. Oh. Well, of course, it's European regulation. So for us, it doesn't really matter if you're talking to Dutch people, Belgian people, Irish people, or British people. Well, it's already mentioned the fine you can get if you don't comply to the regulations. But I'm not too worried about the fine, to be honest, because we're in the garden industry. We're all small businesses, so that's fine. We're not Facebooks, we're not Googles. However, apart from the fine you can get, the negative publicity is way more damaging to your business. Because if people in your own area, 10, 15, 20 miles radius, are talking about you in a birthday party or in their local pub about you losing their data, selling data without their consent, that will harm your business a lot. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about the things you need to do online. So just a brief list of things we need to do. First of all, we need to have a privacy statement, if you don't have one yet. Does anyone have a privacy statement on this website? 1, 2, 3, okay. It's not too much, some work to do the upcoming 2 months. The way we ask permission from customers to send them a newsletter or to sign up for a loyalty card should be changed. We need to make personal data accessible, changeable, and we need to allow people to delete their data, to file a request to delete data. The data processing agreement is a subject to talk about. The procedure you follow for data breaches, the security measures. Some examples of measures you can take. Some are very obvious, some aren't. I'll show them to you in a minute. You also need to limit the data you hold online, and you need to check the forms on your website. Now, first of all, the privacy statement. What should be included in the privacy statement? Who are you? Well, it seems very obvious to have this one on your privacy statement. However...
Sorry to interrupt. Are you going to be able to make this available later?
Absolutely.
Right.
I'll send it over, no worries. Who are you? It's a very obvious question. I don't think you're too worried about letting people know who you are, what your company house number is, and so on. However, a lot of websites online are more tricky, so that they're designed to collect personal data and to sell it. So it's more meant for that kind of companies who try to trick people into quizzes and questionnaires and things like that. So it's very obvious where they are. What do you do with personal data? It's important, and what data do you hold? And I got an example of that. For how long do you hold the data? Well, most people hold the data for, well, as long as they have a system up and running, which is mostly too long. In the privacy statement, you should mention some security measures you have in place. People should know how they can request to delete the data. The cookies you use, that's not something new, but it might be a good moment to reconsider your list of cookies and the cookies you use on your website. The way to complain about it, and we do have a template available if you want. I'm not saying you can just copy paste the template, change the name, that's it, but the template will help you to, well, move into the right direction. Going to the privacy statement, one of the requirements of the GDPR is that you're not vague. And I know a lot of those terms and conditions, things, privacy statements and so on, are normally very vague. And I think you reckon it when you sign up for something, they ask you to agree with the terms and conditions. And you got that box with text, and the only thing you do is scroll down as quick as possible, tick the box, go to the next page. Which makes sense because we're not lawyers, apart from Catherine here today. So we normally try to skip all that and just click on yes, it's okay. Well, that's something which should change a bit. And you should also be very obvious and upfront about the things you're going to do. So it used to be something like we hold your data for as long as we use it. Ta-da, that's the thing we do. Well, that's not really allowed anymore. You should say something like we hold your name, email address until 6 months after unsubscribing for our newsletter. which means what data do we hold? Well, your name, email address. For how long do we store it? Well, we store it for, well, as long as you're subscribed, and if you unsubscribe, we delete your details after 6 months. Makes sense. It's very straightforward, very easy to understand. Now, if this is the line you use in your privacy statement, you can't send out a happy birthday email because you shouldn't ask for a date of birth. If you ask for a name, email address, and a house address, you're not asking for a date of birth, so you can't send out the birthday email. So before you start writing down your privacy statement, consider the marketing communication you want to do. Because if you want to send out that birthday email, it should be part of your privacy statement. So it sounds like a hassle, but if you just think about the things you do or you want to do in the future, or you might want to do in the future, just write them down, add them to your privacy statement, you're fine. Is anyone receiving the Zalando newsletter? You know, Zalando, the fashion store. Anyone? No? Okay. Yeah. How often do you get it?
Oh, like twice a day.
Yeah. That's what they don't mention in their newsletter sign up, because then probably no one will sign up. So this is the Zalando newsletter, and if we go to the GDPR, it requires you to mention the frequency, the kind of emails, you need to have a link to the privacy statement, and you need to save the permission. So what is Zalando doing? They say, well, sign up to the newsletter, you get a £10 discount, which is fine. What you will receive, well, that's fine. Offers, personal recommendations, up-to-date trends and inspiration, that's fine. However, the frequency is not mentioned, and I guess, just a gut feeling, if Zalando says, well, sign up for our twice-a-day newsletter, a lot less people will sign up. However, after the 25th of May, the frequency should be included in the sign-up form. So if you want to do it the right way, it should be something like this. So we send our email vouchers every 2 weeks, so that's the frequency. You will also receive some information about events and news related to the Ghana Center, blah, 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 and a link to the terms of privacy. Well, it's a better way of doing it, and this is the legally allowed way of doing it. Before I continue, I want to have some water, if that's possible now. I get the sore throat of speaking. But this is just an example. As long as you include the frequency, the kind of emails people get, and a link to the privacy statement, that's fine. Yeah, thank you. Much better. Yeah, and there was also something about giving people options what they should subscribe for. If you have a sole newsletter, that could be an ID. If you have a newsletter linked to your loyalty card, you should be able to figure out what people are interested in via your loyalty card, because you can figure out what kind of pet food they're buying, if they buy, well, garden furniture or whatever. So it depends a bit on your situation if you want to have those options on your newsletter. Well, we're talking about online, but it also applies to offline things you're doing. So if you have a quiz night and you ask people to write down their email address, there should be something saying like, if you sign up, our privacy policy applies. Have a look at our website, or something like that. So if you have a form, just a written form, there should be something on the bottom saying what you're going to do with the details of your customers, or people who are applying for a job or whatever. So that's important to do, and what we're going to do in our content management system or our newsletter system is that we add some fields to it, and you need to import that the text. So like this text will be stored in the newsletter system. So if people look back after 2 years, we still have this text linked to their email address, so we can always tell them, well, this is what you sign up for, this is what we're doing, so that's fine. But you should also do it with in-store things you do with written forms. Some people say, well, I just keep the forms in a box in my office. That's fine, but you can also just copy over the text you had on that specific form, import it with an Excel file in your newsletter system, and that's it. Yeah, then the question about the existing newsletter subscribers. I do have a customer who said, well, I'm not going to send emails anymore. So I want everyone to re-opt in from a newsletter. Well, that's the quickest way to get rid of your database, because no one will do it. So what we've been thinking, well, you need to buckle up. Hopefully everyone's buckling up if you go to a car. Texting and driving is not the best thing to do, but I admit I do it every once in a while. I also admit I speed every once in a while. I'm not a saint. In other words, every once in a while we don't 100% comply to the law. And I think this is the best spot in regards to GDPR to not to comply. Why? Well, unless you bought email databases, which you probably haven't done. I know a lot of charities are buying and mixing databases, which is a hassle for them, but they don't get a sense for doing it, or you're doing it. If people signed up 5 years ago for your newsletter, they read it every month, every week. They had 5 years, well, probably 100 times the option to unsubscribe, to hit that unsubscribe button on the bottom of your newsletter. I think they're very happy to read your newsletter after the 25th of May. So if you talk about re-opt-in, I wouldn't do it. That's the advice I give to my customers. It's not 100% compliant to the GDPR. You should obey the law and you should change the sign-up process, but for your existing customers, keep doing what you're doing. People should be able to access, change, and delete data. Well, accessing data isn't that hard, because you probably have, well, for your webshop, you have a login so people can check their data and change their address and things like that. With newsletters, you probably have a system which says, update my details or unsubscribe. So these things are, well, pretty easy to do, but people also have the right to be forgotten in the most reasonable way possible. And that's where the real hassle starts. What we've been doing, we don't necessarily want a lot of people to fill in a form to be forgotten. Makes sense, because then you need to go through the hassle of looking up the data, deleting, blah, blah, blah. So the first trick we applied is that we said, well, if people are that worried about their details, they probably read the privacy statement. So if we add that form in which people can request to their details to be removed to the bottom of the privacy statement, well, not that many people will get to that point. Most people will just unsubscribe themselves from the newsletter and that's it, which is fine. So by having that form on the most unpopular place of the website, will limit the number of people filling it in. Because if you need to delete personal data, you need to delete it from your newsletter system. Makes sense, you need to delete it from your web shop. It's a bit trickier, because if you have a customer in your web shop, you have transactions linked to that customer, so you need to, well, detach those two things from each other. Well, we've gone through that process, so that's fine. However, you also have data on your repo system, on the CRM system. If you're doing data analysis, you may have customer data in that system as well. Your old collection of Excel files is, well, stuffed with personal data of your customers. So the request to be forgotten is quite a hassle for most people, especially if you don't have all your data in one place. So my best suggestion would be to try to limit the number of systems you have which are having all the data. And if you have multiple systems, just source everything from one system, which is for most businesses their EPOS or CRM system. So try to avoid having all those different databases, all those different files. It's a good moment to start looking at the data structure of a company. Well, then the data processing agreement. It's an agreement between you and companies holding or processing data, like my company. We do that for a few hundred companies. Well, legally, well, in the most logical way, you're the owner of the data, so you need to send me the agreement. Well, I've been around in the garden industry for about 15 years, so the last thing which is going to happen is that you send me the agreement. So we decided to turn it around. We've sent our customers the agreement, and I think most data processing companies are doing that as well. However, if you haven't received something, you should ask them for it. because it's important to have that agreement so it's clear what they're doing on your behalf with data, and more importantly, what they don't do with your data. And for those who received our agreement, it fits our situation, so it's not necessarily something you can copy over for other providers. Keep that in mind. Well, what's part of the data processing agreement? The data we collect, so personal data, IP addresses, email addresses, and so on. Why do we do that? Well, we do that to provide you with a website, with a web shop, with analysis, and so on. What are our procedures in case of a data breach? Well, that's a tricky one, but we have a procedure in place. The security measures we took in our office and also online, and I'm going to give you some examples of the security measures we've taken so far. What do we do with data? And that's something for us, because we're working for so many Gartner centers and some of them are competing with each other. We've always been very upfront about the things we do with data, which is basically almost nothing. But it's written down now as well, so it should help us as a company. Where is your data stored? Now keep in mind, if you use Office 365 or Google Apps, Google Drive, your data might be stored in the US, which isn't necessarily a problem, but you should make that obvious if you do that. Well, what happens if there's a data breach? Well, generally speaking, you are already obliged to inform the IKO if you have a serious data breach. However, what's a serious data breach? Most of you will hold, well, names, email addresses, house addresses, transaction history. Well, I don't think any hacker is interested in the fact if I bought some, well, seeds or bulbs from your business. So most importantly, personal details like addresses and email addresses are being stolen or are getting lost. Well, I would say if you have thousands and thousands of customer details and you lose them, and you're very sure you lose them, you can inform the IKO. I haven't dealt with them, but their Dutch equivalent isn't that hard, because if everyone can have a data breach, a stolen phone is a potential data breach, because via your phone I can access your CRM system, I can get into your data. But it's not a shortcut to fine. If you just follow the procedure, anything can happen. Hackers have been breaking in at the FBI offices, at banks, happens every day. Don't worry too much, as long as if you take the right security measures and if it's not something stupid happening. Well, I got a few security measures for you, and for me sometimes it feels like I'm giving a warning which is so obvious it shouldn't be given. Do not hold the wrong end of the chainsaw. Well, this is a serious warning sign. Well, sometimes I feel it's that level, but other things are a bit more complicated. I'm just going to give you some examples of things we've been doing for ourselves or for our customers or with the systems we have to add some security layers to our systems and to our procedures. Well, first of all is the Google Authenticator app. Is anyone familiar with the Authenticator already? I'm very sure you'll get confident with it soon enough. What happens if you log in on a system like our newsletter system or our webshop system, you log in with a username and password, which means if someone has your username and password, you can log in from any device, anywhere, because it's all online based. To add an extra security layer, every now and then we ask people to verify themselves, and this is something we'll implement in April. We ask them to verify themselves with their mobile phone. And that's where the Authenticator app comes in. So if people want to log in, they need to have your email address, your password, but also access to your phone. So it adds another layer of security. So if you have online systems with sensitive data and more accounts are being processed online, for example, well, ask your provider, your software company, whatever, if a dual login is available. It looks like a hassle, but it only happens maybe once a week you need to enter the code, or if you use a different device. A password manager. What happens on your laptop? Your logging in on different systems and websites all the time. So you have all those passwords stored probably in your web browser. Does anyone know how easy it is to get those passwords if you're using Internet Explorer or Google Chrome to store them? Anyone? You see those dots, you know? You see username, you see those dots. Okay. I'll show you a movie I made last night. How easy it is to get that data. Let's see. Oop. So I'm logging in. So just to put it on hold, so this is my username and here's the password. This is what you normally see. So if you give your laptop to someone or if your employees are working on your computer, you think, well, they can log in, but they can't find my password. True? That's what you think. Okay. Well, and this is a trick everyone can do. So what I'm doing, I do a right click on this box. You get this screen and everyone's having that. I'm not a developer, so no worries, it's not technical. Just remove one word from the code of the website. And there we go, there's the password. Well, my password is DHCA is great in this case. You can try to log in, won't work, but just to give you an idea how easy it is to access passwords on your laptop if you're not using a password manager. So my suggestion, install a password manager, it makes your life easier, way more secure than using the autofill option in your browser.
Did you say install password manager? So that's
Yeah. Another sensitive thing is the USB stick. And of course I do know what's happening in the Netherlands in regards to this. It took me, well, 5 seconds on Google to find the proper example happening in the UK. Someone has, well, apparently security plans or details from Heathrow Airport or the Queen or, well, maybe combined. And all of a sudden, USB stick got lost somewhere on the street. Ooh, issue. Well, quite a big issue in this case. The best way to avoid this is by not using USB sticks. They always get lost. People always just grab them from your desk because they need something, blah, blah, blah. If you need to transfer big files, go to WeTransfer.com. It's free to use, very easy, very straightforward, and way more secure than using a USB stick. Yeah, well, this one is so obvious, it's like the chainsaw message, but okay, here we go. Having a proper up-to-date virus scanner on your computer. And Microsoft did a survey or some research at the end of last summer, and they figured out that not even half of the Windows 7 PCs was having a proper antivirus scanner having installed. In other words, half of the computers is wide open to anyone who's reasonably able to hack a bit. We're using Symantec. Used to be known as Norton. It's about $250 a month for each computer we have. It's always up to date, and well, if you're not willing to spend $250 a month, it's penny wise, and hopefully for you, not, but I'm afraid it will be pound foolish. Well, if you have any issues with your website and you have a security breach online, one of the first things someone will look at is there an SSL certificate being installed on the website? Well, I'm sure you recognize this one. This says this website is secure, which is basically meaning that the communication between the visitor of your website and the server where the website is hosted is encrypted. So if I fill in my name is not being sent out over the internet. There's a whole long hash of numbers and letters sent over the internet, and the server decrypted. So if someone is interrupting the connection between my computer and the server, they can't do anything with that information. Now, if your website is not secure, my name, Edwin, is being sent over on the internet as it is, which is more insecure. Okay, you might think, well, I'm not having a web shop and credit card details are not being entered on my website. That's fine. Google is promoting a safer internet. And what they're doing is that they push secure websites higher on the rankings and they put the insecure websites lower. And it's only a matter of time, and we expect it to happen during the summer, that if you don't have a secure website, people will get a warning message. So right now it's quite friendly, so it says secure or nothing, and that will change. So if you don't have one yet, ask your provider to sort this out. Do a login. Well, it's the same thing as the username password issue you have online. You also have it with your laptop. So if people have your username and password, they can access your laptop. Via your laptop, you can access all the other passwords. So laptops are quite sensitive in regards to the security. So what we've been doing, well, we still have this Windows screen. I assume you know the Windows screen. We've added a boot login, and you need to swipe your fingerprint to access the computer. So to access most of the laptops of my team members, you need to cut off a finger, ask them for a username and a password. This is more trickier than just having a username and a password. Another one, don't leave your PC unattended. Well, it happens to me quite often that I'm traveling to the UK, I have to wait at the airport, I'm working in the lounge, and I need to go to the restroom. It happens sometimes. Well, I don't want to put my stuff in my bag, go to the restroom, come back, and mostly I feel pretty secure in the airline lounges, so that's fine. However, you don't want to leave your laptop open and people can just access all your data. And the same situation for you in your garden center, when you have a customer desk or something like that, or your repo system, if people walk away from it, they should lock the computer. And it sounds like a hassle, but it's very easy. On every keyboard, well, I can't show it because it's wired now. On the left bottom, there's a Windows icon, small icon for for squares. If you hit that and the letter L, it says Windows lock. It locks your Windows, and it goes to this screen again. Yes, you need to log in if you come back, but it's way more secure. So this is a physical one, because we get all the security measures in place, blah, blah, blah. However, if someone comes, he just takes my laptop, walks away, and I'm still lost. Because I don't know if they're able to hack into my laptop when they are in the comfort of their own home. So what we've been doing, we bought laptop cables, and these are about 10, 15 pounds at most, and every laptop is being locked via the laptop cable. Now, if you don't use laptops, which is not very common in garden centers, you have a desktop computer, well, you can do the same. Well, depending on your customer base, you can opt for the easy solution, which is a little bit less tough. So you have a cable attached to your monitor via your desktop to the wall. Well, if you're in a bad area, you might want to have this entire case to secure your desktop. Might be a little bit too much. A clean desk policy. Is anyone having a clean desk policy in the garden? I've never seen one, so it's, you all start laughing, but you know what I'm going to talk about. Well, Catherine already mentioned it. There's so much information in the paperwork you have on your desk, and it's so easy to grab something to take it with you. And I'm totally not interested in your invoices or packing lists from Ella or KDix or whatever, but sometimes there might be something interesting for someone, maybe for your employees or customers who are just strolling along your office or whatever. Having a clean desk policy helps you to tidy up your desk every day. And this is not a photo taken in my office. What will never ever happen in my office. I think another positive thing of having a clean desk policy is that normally you work in a little bit more efficient way. So having a clean desk policy is security, but it's also a way to be more effective. Okay, you have those computers, but every 3-4 years you need to renew them. And what a lot of people do is that they bring their stuff to a recycle station. So there's a lot of rare metals in it, and you're not allowed to throw it away. So okay, that's fine. Bring it to a recycle station. Keep doing that. However, take out your hard drive, because you never know what's going to happen from the moment you drop your stuff at the recycle station, and then, well, and then what? Well, they're going to recycle stuff, but you never know who's going to take your hard disk. So to avoid that from happening, just grab a screwdriver, open your PC. There are 4 screws, 2 cables connected to your hard disk. Very easy to take it out. Everyone can do that. And then at least you have your hard disk. Now, the next step is that people ask me, Edwin, what do I need to do with my hard disk? Okay, good question. The formal answer on that is having a company specialized in destroying data to collect it and to destroy it. The more informal answer is to create a nice campfire in the summer and throw it in. It will do the job. It's not very eco-friendly, I know, but okay. A measure we also have taken is to encrypt data we hold. So if you don't encrypt data, you will have something like this: username, password. Well, the username Stefan and the password Paul. Well, this is literally the password. Now, how do you know if people are holding your password literally and they don't hash it, so they encrypt your password? If you click on a forgotten password link on a website, so you enter your email address, if they're able to send you the password you entered in their system, it's stored insecure. So it's a very bad sign, because that company has this one list and consider it to be an Excel file, usernames, passwords. If someone gets to that data, they can access every, online system, online account you have with that username and password. And a lot of people use the same password and username for a lot of systems, so that's a real security issue. So what we do is that we hash all the passwords, and we're in the process of hashing all the email addresses as well. That applies to the newsletter system. So what we want to do is that we want to show the email addresses if you log in, but on the back end, it's all stored encrypted. So even if people are able to break into our servers, they can't just download a file of email addresses from our customers. It's all encrypted. Limit access to files internally. I do know most centers only have a small team working in the office, which is fine, because people work in the office cost money, and they make the money if you're out in the center. But as a matter of fact, they also share everything with anyone, apart from some stuff the owner keeps on his own laptop, but most of the networks are pretty open. But that's not the best way forward. So what you'd better do, first of all, log who's accessing which data, so you can trace back who's opening which file. It helps you to figure out what happened if you have any issues. And you should set up your internal network in a way so people can only access the files they need to use. So if they don't need to use it, they don't need to access it, just don't grant them access to it. This might be a little bit tricky, so ask your system administrator to have a look at that, but it's worth the effort. Another one, limit the data you hold. Now, you can imagine we have some customers who've been with us for almost 15 years. Well, we renewed their website a couple of times, but sometimes the CMS remains the same. So we have data going a long way back. Now, what's the reason you want to have data, so like a contact form or job applications from 3-4 years ago? There's no reason to have the data in your system. So what we're going to do from April and onwards, we're going to automatically remove every contact form after 24 months. So we hold it for 24 months, and then the data will be removed. And the same applies to the newsletters. So if people unsubscribe for a newsletter, we'll remove their data automatically after 6 months. Now there's one, issue we have with the last one. We know a lot of our customers are Excel file freaks, so they have everything in Excel files. And every now and then they want to import all the data into the newsletter system. Now, until this moment, we hold all the details of people who unsubscribe for the newsletter. So if people import all data, we can still, remove the ones who unsubscribe. That's going to change. So there's a risk people are going to import old files. so everyone will be subscribed again. That's the risk we're willing to take because it's very obvious you shouldn't have old files with old data on your computer, and we can't design a system for stupidity, as we call it. So we don't want to hold data if it's not required to hold it. So we're going to remove it after 6 months, and if you keep your systems up to date as well, then there's no hassle. But if you're lazy, insecure, not really aware what you're doing, yeah, then you may have an issue, but you probably have other issues in that case as well. Another thing we're going to look at for our customers is that they're not over-asking. So sometimes people have a loyalty card, they ask a lot of personal details, and the question is, well, do you need all those details? So that's something we're going through with our customers, and well, remove your collection of Excel files. Really just do it. So have one system or 2 or 3 systems. I know one system is a little bit optimistic, but only a few systems with data, and preferably not Excel. Excel is not a system, Excel is a file. Well, the data protection officer, not going into too much details, but you need to appoint someone if you have over 5,000 customers, which some garden centers will have. But also if you process data, if you profile it, if you combine data and so on. And that's, most people who are having a loyalty card and doing things like that, so you might need to appoint a data protection officer. Well, one of the most important things of the data protection officer is to overlook the process. So are the procedures in place, is it going well? But you should also create awareness among staff. And apart from the fact if you need a data protection officer, it's good to make everyone aware in your company that GDPR is coming, privacy is an issue, give them the example of their own Facebook account, let them download the Facebook account so they can see how powerful data is and how much data companies hold of individuals. And this should create awareness among your staff, among your team. So every time they do something, so someone figures out, oh, well, let's do an Easter egg hunt next week, they create a form. It should be a natural thing to say, oh, well, if we create a form, we're taking details of customers, so we need to refer to the privacy policy. And that's what you need to do from now on. It's not that complicated. Hopefully, I think you all think, well, okay, we need to do something, but it's doable. Well, myself or GDPR and Garden Connect, I'm happy to help anyone, but we're no lawyers. So I don't expect accept any liability. We just provide you with the advice. If you really want to be 100% compliant, or maybe 95% compliant, just ask Catherine or someone else to help you. As a courtesy, because I know you got a lot of things going on, it happens to be Easter weekend, the upcoming weekend. It might be a little bit busy, too busy to think about the GDPR, hopefully, the upcoming days. And well, after Easter, the season starts, and when the season starts, it's the 25th of May in the blink of an eye. So we're happy to have a quick look at your website for free. Yeah, we do something for free every now and then. Sjors, my colleague, has a small form. If you give me your email address and your website, of course, you give me permission to do anything I want with your details. That's the small print. But we'll give you some tips for your website. And we're happy to share the template of the privacy statement with you as well. Again, don't copy and paste that one, just literally on the website, but you can use it to, well, it's a good starting point. Any questions? Well, that means everything was clear. I was speaking way too fast and it was too complicated, so no one understands and we're ready for a coffee. Oh, yeah, sure.
So we use your wonderful services for our
very good
for our garden club.
Yeah.
Transposing data from one thing to another. So
yeah.
We request that customers fill out. We have a postcard that fill out. Says join our garden club free on it. Yeah. So they fill out the data on that. Yeah. I had a stack of those printed up not long ago and probably didn't put all the right tick boxes on or whatever, but that can be addressed maybe next time around. Yeah. I'm figuring that because they filled out a form to say that they want to join the club, we're pretty much okay for it for the time being. Yeah. But then when we put that data onto your system, we are then choosing to send a newsletter to them. I think there's a couple of other tick boxes on there.
Yeah.
So once we've put in their name, their email address,
Yeah.
male, female,
Yeah.
I think it's a phone
Yeah,
number, or
that's-
whatever other
yeah.
data was on there. And then there's some tick boxes. I think it's one for the newsletter, and there's a couple of other requirements. And we're filling that out.
Yeah.
That's we're filling out that on their behalf. So they're not choosing any other
No.
specifics.
But they've entered the form in store, so that's fine. The only thing we're going to add to that is a mandatory field, that's what I say. So you have to fill it in. It's mandatory, yeah. Which says, and that's up to you to do, say, how did you get this email address? Or what's the consent people have given? And then you need to copy the text on the form, more or less, or make a summary of that. So that's imported into the system with the customer details. So whenever you go back, you can see, oh well, someone participated in the Easter egg hunt, they filled in the form, well, you threw away the form, but you can still look back where those details were coming from.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the change we're going to make. And if people unsubscribe for something, we're going to remove them automatically after 6 months.
Okay.
So that's the process we're going to follow. Yeah. So worst case scenario, people unsubscribe, a year later they come back for next year's Easter egg hunt, they sign up again, you enter them to the system and they're going to start asking questions. Well, I think I unsubscribed, so why are you sending me this email? Well, then you can go back to the system and say, well, you signed up during the Easter egg hunt last week, so that's why you get it.
Okay, so linking the two things in with Catherine,
Yeah.
if I'm having those physical postcards filled in, we don't keep those at the moment, or we'd better to throw those away, shred them, get rid of them, or keep them as consent that they were joining the garden club in the first place. So there's kind of a little bit of balance there. Do we put them under lock and key, or do we shred them and get rid of them?
I think
better to keep that data or throw it away.
I think the best answer is to keep them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's also a bit impractical to keep all the forms for years.
Yeah.
That's why we added the option to the system. Yeah.
Okay.
At the end of the day, it's whichever way you do it, it's a question of evidence, and evidence is never 100% perfect, because even if you keep the physical cards and keep them under lock and key, it's always possible somebody forgets to put the card away or whatever, so there's always going to be slight sort of imperfections. But I think the important thing is that you come up with a system of recording the information that you get, or the way that the consent was given, or whatever, in a way that's kind of going to be sort of practical for you and your staff to kind of follow. There's no point trying to keep every little bit of evidence if it's going to make your job too sort of inefficient.
I think that's where it's useful to use someone like because it's tidier to keep it on both. But that also links into the website. As you know, I think we had a chat before. We have a website provided by somebody else, and we have this. It's housekeeping, a lot of this. Talking about. So actually putting might be good business for you. Lump everything.
Thank you.
Lump everything.
Just keep talking. Keep talking.
It's fine. Into another meeting with you, but from my point of view, that seems to make sense. Just most of what we've talked about is housekeeping and lumping things together in one concise fashion, and having the least amount of contacts as possible, reducing the security risks.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. And although short term it's inevitably going to be a bit of pain, because housekeeping always is, but I think, you know, longer term you should feel the benefits, not just in terms of the legal stuff, but actually it can give benefits to the business, because you will operate more efficiently, because when you want some information, you just go to one place rather than having to hand it around.
Exactly. It's for efficiency. Thank you.
Have I misunderstood the unsubscribe? As a consumer, I think to wait 6 months is unacceptable to be unsubscribed if you've requested unsubscribe. Have I misunderstood what you've said?
No, you're absolutely. We keep your details after unsubscribing for 6 months. That's what I said.
So you keep it on the system?
On the system.
You're not
actively using it. Why don't you delete straight away?
Well,
it just
right now, every email system, if you unsubscribe, you're in the system forever. Because you need,
you're just unsubscribing from communication.
yeah. But your details are still in the
Data's still
system. So if you log in on your email system, you can see your subscribers and your unsubscribers. However, in the GDPR says you shouldn't hold data any longer than required, than really necessary. And having an unsubscriber on your system for, say, 5 years is pretty pointless. Why don't we delete it straight away? Well, we want to give our customers the time to update other systems they have. So if you unsubscribe, every 3-4 months, people can make an export of all the unsubscribers, match that with another system if they have something else, and then afterwards the information will be entirely removed.
Yes.
So I can understand your question, but looking at where most email systems are right now, it's a huge improvement anyway. Yeah. But you won't receive any emails during that time frame unless you resubscribe again. Yeah. Was another question or?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Fine,
One question.
fine.
You said earlier on that servers shouldn't be keeping your passwords, and
No.
if they send you your password, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Is it the same as when you go to a website and they say you can't use that password because that's an old password?
Yeah.
Does that mean they're keeping your password?
They do keep it, but it depends a little bit how they keep it. But yeah, and I know passwords are a bit tricky. Some say you need to have different passwords for different systems, blah, blah. However, the risk is if you have all those different passwords, you make an Excel file with all your passwords. So it's a bit pro and con, but in regards to security, if people are able to send you the password, the system is insecure. That's the rule of thumb.
There's some apps for keeping passwords.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Are they good? Are they something they secure?
More secure than your browser. Yeah, it's all. Look, if you have a device, a laptop or your phone, there's always some insecurity involved, and you can't change that. The question is how interesting is the information you have for hackers, and how big is the chance to target you as an individual to get your data. Having a password manager makes sure all your passwords are stored encrypted on your device, so it hires the barrier to get access to your systems. That's what it does. And there are a lot of password managers, and you can just Google a few of them to see which are the best ones and which aren't.
How do you know if you need a DPO or not? So I'm not sure if we actually need one.
Well, you have a newsletter, or
Second?
do you have a newsletter?
We send out marketing, yeah.
Yeah, and how do you do that?
It's not a newsletter, we'll go through MailChimp.
Yeah.
It's not like a regular newsletter, but when we've got some new products or...
So then you need to DPA with MailChimp. They have one if you log in, so you just need to look around a bit. They have one available, so you can just sign that one, but you need to do it. Yeah.
So what, MailChimp have a DPO? Or?
Yeah.
So we don't need one ourselves?
No, but, well...
Did you say DPO?
Yeah, Data Protection Officer.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, DPO, sorry. Yeah. No, if you just have a newsletter with less than 5,000 people, there's no reason to have a DPO. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we've got...
What data you have?
Well, yeah, it also depends on if you're processing special category data, like health data and that sort of thing. But I think whether or not you actually, I suspect you don't need a DPO, but I think it's still sensible to have someone in the organisation who is kind of primarily responsible for privacy issues, so that you've got somebody who's coordinating stuff, particularly in terms of if ever you receive a subject access request or there's a breach issue, if there's one kind of point of coordination who is the person that everyone knows to go to when something like that occurs, it would probably be sort of sensible from a practical point of view anyway.
Any other questions? Sure.
Does this mean the death of third-party lists? So, or is there a legitimate need to access those third-party lists?
Well, using third-party lists has always been tricky anyway, because you may not know where the data was coming from. And a few years ago, new legislation has been introduced in regards to email marketing, as you probably all remember. So if it's that, I don't think so. And I also know a lot of charities rely on it, so they match all the data with each other, but it's getting way more complicated to do that. Yeah, and I haven't seen a lot of garden centers doing it, so I don't think you should worry too much about it being in this industry.
But I think the sort of direct mail industry that kind of, you know, is sort of involved with that, I think they're kind of pushing quite heavily to be able to kind of, you know, keep a lot of what they're doing now, and I think it's I think it would be unrealistic to expect that after the 25th of May that sort of stuff will stop, and it'll be interesting to see how much kind of, you know, cold calling and that sort of stuff will continue, but hopefully over time, you know, the sort of the sort of landscape will change, but I don't think it's going to be an immediate sort of end of it.
I was going to ask, are there any rules for how we need to provide customers with their data if they request it?
Oh, it's fantastic how they describe that. It should be in a machine-readable form. Well, that's how the IKO describes it. In normal human way, we would say provide them with an Excel file. So that something like that can be useful. I downloaded my Facebook history, and it comes as a zip file with all my photos I ever uploaded, all my chat history, everything in different formats. It should be something people are able to read. So if you use an accounting program or CRM system to store details, you can't send them an export from your CRM system, which is only accessible via that system. So normally it will be an Excel file or a CSV file or a text file or something like that.
But do we also need to send them information about every time we contact them, or is it literally just saying, look, we hold your email address, your blah, 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 blah,
yeah, it's
for our newsletter?
The information that they're entitled to is the information about them.
About them, okay, not the process of every time we've emailed them.
No, I can't see it.
No. I also think it depends a bit on the nature of your business, because with social media they store everything anyway, and then they need to hand it over. But well, you're calling your customers, you're interacting with them by email, and there's no reasonable reason to have a track record of all those things, an audit track.
But I suppose if you had you know, an email exchange, say you had a customer who had a complaint and you had an email exchange about that complaint, then they'd be entitled to all of those emails. And it comes back to the point about trying not to keep zillions of emails forever. You know, if you haven't got it, then you can't, you know, to go back through 10 years worth of emails, that's a bit of a headache. So the less you've got to search through, the better, really.
Yes, I just had a question about what you can and can't do with card payment details. So I had a garden centre where people phone in and purchase things over the telephone, and you put it in directly into the EPOS system, customer present, and obviously that goes and sends the sale. I suspect that's okay. But for our landscaping maintenance division, we take a card payment over the phone as a deposit, and then we complete the works, and then normally we would say, because of bad payments, once the job is completed, we would send a final invoice and say 7 days after receiving the invoice, we will take the final outstanding amount if you haven't questioned it from the card details you paid your deposit with. But obviously we're having to store those details. So is that allowed or not allowed?
How are you, so where is it, where the card details stored?
So we're basically on the worksheet of the client. We encode it like one, and then in our management files we code one and then the details. Obviously there's no address linked to that in one area. You'd have to have both the worksheet and the secure file on our system. So or how can you do it if that's obviously not the right way? Because clearly if you're not able to store payment details, you know, we're not going to get paid for lots of the work that we do, because people just going to pay whenever they want. You know? So after you've completed work,
it is a bit difficult. I mean, there's a whole lot of rules around card payments and how that sort of stuff is secure, which I'm sort of not an expert on. But I think you've got to be very careful with storing card payment details, even if those details on their own can't be linked to someone else, because clearly if it's all the details that you need bar the name, that's still probably quite valuable information if it got into the wrong hands, and all that someone would need is that extra bit of information with the customer's name to link the two together.
Well, they need the name, the address.
They wouldn't necessarily need the name, the address, would they? They just need the name. But if in one place you've got everything bar the name, that, to my way of thinking, is quite a lot of information. And because the only other thing that you need in order to use that credit card information and do transactions is the person's name. So I haven't got a sort of immediate answer how you get around that. It doesn't feel terribly great from just sort of instinctively. I mean, obviously there's questions completely outside of that in terms of, changing the way that you, customers pay you in the first place. And, one way would be, rather than just take a deposit, should you be looking at getting stage payments all the way through, so that what you're left with at the end is a relatively small
We do that with big
payment.
projects, but where it's just like an afternoon garden clearance, it's a £300 bill, they've paid a 30% deposit and the remainder is on completion.
Yeah.
So it's not a big amount of money, but obviously just people not pay, which rarely is, it happens. They just, oh, that's not priority, I'm not going to pay that. Then you have to phone, then you have to email them.
What about taking, like if you hire a car when you go abroad and they take a deposit that doesn't actually come off your car, but it's like a security, and then if you damage the car, whatever, they've got the money kind of reserved on your credit card. And is that sort of a way that you could do it?
I don't know, but I just don't know where to really find that out, because it's quite a big factor in our business model. It's sort of more than half of our revenue comes through that type of work. So that's why I'm asking the question, because I can understand holding the details is not great, but also what could be in place for businesses like myself where we need payment and people aren't going to pay because they're not going to phone back.
I would just thought doing that sort of card deposit, taking the extra, the balance just as a deposit, so it's not actually coming off their credit card, so they can pay by other means, but on the understanding that if they don't pay, that you can then fall on the deposit might be a way
but
forward.
aren't you therefore still having to record the details?
I don't know how it works. Presumably people who provide the card machines and so on.
I think there are online solutions for that, so you can just store all the data online, which is encrypted. So I think if you go online search, something like that should be available. You might want to contact SagePay or WorldPay. They could have solutions for that available already.
Okay.
Because as a rule of thumb, we never want to have credit card details in our service, because that's one of the most sensitive things hackers want to have. So
exactly, just my sort of instinct was it's just kind of inviting trouble to be storing that sort of information, because if something goes wrong, it is bad information to be, it's not just like an email address or something. It's most people would regard the credit card details as one of the things they'd least want to get into wrong hands.
Just going back to databases, I think I know the answer to this, but just to be absolutely clear, we have to ask people if they want to stay on our database, and they actively have to come back and say yes. I mean, the risk of losing.
You have to do that formally, but I suggest you don't do that.
Oh, what I was going to say is that exactly that. If we ask them,
they won't do it.
By implication, and they don't get back to us, which probably the majority won't get back to us, then that's a statement of something. If we don't ask them, then we haven't kind of asked the question, and they haven't, by implication, by not coming back, answered the question.
No.
So you're saying if we don't ask, so it is okay To just keep going with our database and not answer
No.
questions?
The issue is, you may have a database with people who signed up 4 years ago. So you don't have the proof of their subscription anymore on your system or on the written forms or whatever. GDPR says you need to have the proof stored linked to the subscription. So that's the issue. So you don't have that.
And some of them we got from things like what we buyers go
Yeah.
out.
So you don't have the data, you don't comply to the law, period. That's it. So formally, you need to ask them, do you still want to receive our newsletter? If they don't opt in, you don't have the proof, so they opt out, period. That's the formal way. My suggestion, you received the approval to send them a newsletter in the past, but you just happen to have lost the written approval. So I say just keep sending them emails as long as you haven't bought any database from third parties, if you haven't tricked people into something, I think you're fine. So I wouldn't send them an email to say, do you still want to receive our newsletter?
But if we have bought a database, or if we have got it from somewhere, then we have to, because I don't think we now know which came from which.
Yeah,
you know,
well then the risk is higher, but if you bought it 4 years ago and it's only a few hundred email addresses maybe because you bought a small company, a local nursery or whatever, yeah, then it might be still acceptable not doing it, but that's the risk you have to
and
judge for
you
yourself.
also obviously need to, whatever you decide to do and however you assess the risks in relation to the data that you've got on your database at the moment, obviously going forward you need to make sure that you get the opt-in consent, and then in relation to the historic stuff, it's as Edwin says, it's a case of thinking, well, which is the where does the how big a risk is it, and is it a risk that we're prepared to take? It also depends a bit on how much stuff you're sending to people, how frequently, whether there's any mechanism that you can sort of do for tracking whether people are responding to emails, and maybe you could say, well, we'll keep sending emails to the old database people without getting a consent, but we'll keep an eye on who's actually opening those emails, and for the ones who aren't opening them, we'll pull those ones off after a certain period of time or whatever. So you're trying to make inroads into that kind of rumpus stuff that's non-compliant.
Anyone having a last question?
I'm conscious that there's been a lot of questions asked, and I know, Carl, that there's a panel session, so I didn't know if you wanted to set that up. Or...
Okay. Well, maybe 3 last things. First of all, you can join our Facebook group to stay up to date. You can ask yours if you want to have your website being checked over the upcoming weeks. And as an HTA member, I would like to vote to get rid of the USB sticks the HTA is providing to its members to prevent any security issues in the future. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, I may have missed the introduction at the beginning, but sorry, I don't know who James is.
I'm from HTA Insurance Services, so we can offer certain insurance products that help mitigate some of the risks around GDPR and cyber liability.
Right.
So, I mean, some costing's been done by various insurers that work around this area, and the cost of fixing a data breach of roughly 1,000 records is between £33 and £35 a record. So there are now policies with certain limits that will meet some of these costs if there are data breaches involved. Will pay PR costs, they will meet some of the fines and levies as long as they're not criminal fines, and they will pay legal defence costs involved with defending a cyber liability attack, and offer assistance in managing it, bringing in IT forensics to try and restore the system. And in scenarios where someone has hacked into your data and is threatening to release the data as a breach, they may well meet some of those ransoms and pay the fines to get the data returned and the system up and running.
Does that actually happen, being held to ransom for details?
Yes.
Does
I mean, this is a massive growing area. Various insurance companies have come up with different products. We had a gentleman in talking to us about it, about an optician. One of the secretaries went in, had an email saying you've been caught speeding. She clicked on the link, and the Russian, some kind of system, encrypted the whole optician's IT system, and they asked for 50,000 Bitcoin to release it, and they couldn't do anything because all the records of all their customers, their previous eye exams were all held online, so they couldn't do anything for 3 days while they tried to resolve the issue.
It also happened to Mars, the Danish shipper. So if you import products from China, you may figure out that your Mars ship was a few days later. That's because their system was hacked and they had to pay bitcoins as well to get back into their own system. So it's quite a serious issue. Yeah, and I don't know if it happens in the UK. Would be surprised if it doesn't. But a lot of private people who don't have a fear scanner on their laptop, they're being hacked as well. All their photos are being decrypted and only encrypted if you decrypted if you pay a ransom, as in £100 or something like that. So it's quite a serious issue. Oh, keep it away if you don't know what it is. Keep it away because if it doesn't happen, it's fine. But it's happening. Yeah.
Do any of you think it's worth doing a cyber essentials scheme? Is that going to help? Like a government scheme?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that it's certainly recommended for a lot of businesses. I'm not sort of specialist in the cyber sort of security, but talking to people who are, the view seems to be that it's a sort of really good idea for many businesses. Obviously, there's cost associated with it. I think the what's it called, the NCSC website, which kind of has the information about the sort of things that you need to do in order to get the Cyber Essentials accreditation, is probably worth a look in any event, because even if you don't go for the accreditation, there's kind of information on there about the steps that you need, or the hoops that you need to jump through in order to get the accreditation, and there may be some useful things that you can do at least to make a step in that direction. I think off the top of my head, I think I've sort of heard people saying usually the cost of getting the accreditation is something like £2,000 to £3,000, but in the scheme of things, it's probably worth it for a lot of businesses. I think there's quite a lot that you have to do in order to reach that standard, but it seems to be more and more businesses are going for it.
I think you can do a self-assessment for about £400 on that.
Right. Yeah.
I just don't know if it's actually worth doing.
Yeah, well, certainly the people I've spoken to seem to think it's a good idea. So that, we're a law firm, we've got Cyber Essentials, we're now going for the kind of Cyber Essentials Plus thing, and I think more and more businesses will be kind of going that way as time goes on. And a lot of it, I think, sort of talking to people who are kind of experts in this area, a lot of it I sort of understand is kind of really kind of common sense sort of stuff, which is why I think even if you don't go for accreditation immediately, actually implementing some of the things that they think people should be doing is a good idea. So things like making sure that you're not allowing people to members of staff to plug their own private machines into your IT system, so who knows what stuff their kids have downloaded onto the laptop or whatever, it could mess up your system, things like that, really basic kind of things, but good ideas that are quite easy to implement.
I've got a couple of questions that have been sent through from some people that couldn't be here today that want raising. So we've covered a few of them, but there's some kind of nitty-gritty bits that perhaps can help with. One of them's about application forms and CVs. In the case of a failed application, does the paperwork have to be destroyed or retained? And they're citing the fact that previously they've had to keep application forms to prove they weren't discriminating against minority, ethnics, etc. And if GDPR requires the forms to be destroyed, how do they prove discrimination?
Yeah. you know, I'm not an employment lawyer, but we've taken the view that you really don't need to keep CVs and application forms from unsuccessful applicants for any real sort of length of time, and we would say 3 months is sort of more than adequate. This issue about proving discrimination, you know, I sort of understand that, you know, people would be concerned if they were on the receiving end of a suggestion that they sort of discriminated in the application process, but I suspect it's unlikely that actually the CV or the application form is going to help that prove that claim one way or the other. So I think the sort of simple rule is, you know, 3 months, get rid of CVs, and you know, don't worry too much.
Okay. And on a similar note, what about somebody, an employee that's then left the company? How long after they leave is that information?
Yeah, employees are a different sort of category, simply because once somebody has been employed, they have up to 6 years to bring a claim for breach of contract. Now, it's unlikely that, you know, most disgruntled employees are probably going to be making a claim much sooner than that. However, I think it's you would be justified in keeping HR records for 6 or maybe 7 years after the person has left. And I appreciate that's quite a long time, and some businesses might say, well, actually, we're not going to keep them that long, and you know, we'll take a risk in the event of a claim. But I think that you would be safe to keep them for 6 or 7 years.
Thank you. And then the last point relates to the example of the kind of payroll bureau. And the question is, when managers email data to that third party, do they then need to delete the emails from the sent box, or is a password on the computer sufficient?
I think that sending payroll information either out, in or out by emails are not a good idea. It needs to be done in some sort of encrypted sort of way.
Okay. Thank you.
And actually, I've got an example. We act for a charity who used a payroll company, and the payroll company just sent the information sort of by email. I'm not sure where they were sending it, but they just used ordinary email to send it, and you know, used the sort of drop-down email address thing and managed to send all of the payroll details to the wrong person. So it does happen, and I would sort of say email's not the way to go for payroll information.
Bearing in mind what we've been saying today, I'm kind of assuming that a double sign-in for things like newsletter sign-ups is nice to have, but not necessary. Is that the case?
A double opt-in?
A double opt-in where, you know, they sign in and you then send an email saying you've registered to sign in on this link. I mean, I'm assuming it's a nice to have, but not.
It's a nice to have. I think with the kind of emails garden centers are sending, I wouldn't bother too much that I'm signing up someone else for your newsletter. You can think of subjects you can sign up for on websites, which can be a bit harassing to other people. So if I sign you up for specific stuff, then if you do anything related to porn, for example, then you might want to have a double opt-in. But I guess you don't do that, being at the HTA event. So I wouldn't bother about it.
Okay. That's what I thought I was.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother about it.
I agree.
At least everyone's awake now.
As I said before, we're trade, so all of our customers have to fill in a trade application form, and they have to supply with that proof of trade. So they're going to fill that form with all the information, and 9 times out of 10, business card or letterheaded note paper. At the moment, we keep those physically. We've got a filing cabinet that goes back years and years and years. So we've got 2 copies of their information. So my question is, A, how long do we need to keep that for? Because there have to be trade to deal with us, so we have to have that proof of trade. So do we need to keep both aspects of that? That A, they've filled in the application form, and that B, we also have a business card or a letter-headed.
Yeah. I think as a general principle it's better just to have one system with all the records, with all the information in one place rather than having two. But I appreciate that at the moment you've got one system with actually the contact details and then the proof of trade somewhere else. And I just wonder whether you could kind of marry up the two in some way. So could you like save a PDF of like the business card or the letterhead and save it onto the same system as the contact details? Is that sort of doable? And then you could bin all the hard copies?
Quiet time, but it's doable.
Yeah. Well, I would, appreciate, you've sort of got other things to do, but it might be over a period of time trying to move. It's not a big risk area, so I don't think it needs to be treated as a priority, but I would suggest that, as you say, over, when times are quieter and you can catch up with a bit of housekeeping, it would be a good thing to do. For no other reason, as much just because you've then trimmed down the amount of stuff that you've got, and what you've got on a particular business is just in one place rather than in two.
Okay.
And you can also bear in mind, if you only sell to other businesses, or if you're a trade, only other rules apply in regards to email marketing. So if you have a customer relationship with someone, you are, within some boundaries, allowed to send them an email.
Okay, so
it's a bit different if you deal with personal data.
So we don't have. So okay, let's go back to the kind of newsletter email, because we are business to business trade nursery. So all of us customers, as I say, sign up to deal with us.
Yeah.
So every month when I'm sending out my marketing, really informative, entertaining emails, do I need to, with this coming up, do I need to actually contact these people and say, you still need to opt in for me to contact you, or not? Well, because it's not B2C, it's a B2B business.
But the presumably your emails are going to individual contacts within the businesses.
Yes.
So although you might say that the amount of personal data there is very limited, e.g. it's just like catherine.ripley@fsp-law.com or something, it's still a piece of personal data. Okay. So in theory, the same rules apply, but it comes back to this debate we've been already having about legitimate interest versus consent, and how practical is it to get consent, and the fact that you're sending material on a B2B basis will probably sort of reduce the risk in terms of not getting consent, or not getting consent from the people that are on your historic database. I think going forward you still need to be seeking consent, even though they're B2B. But I think that's just another kind of strand that might sort of persuade you to not go for consent for further marketing to the existing database.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I think that's fine here with all of the questions. So hopefully you found that useful this morning. And thank you to the team for the information today. As I said, the slideshows will be sent out to all of you. So if anybody has got any further questions or anything that you want to ask today,